sexy guys do. Explore what's all in their minds. Thinking about a thing or two, about a thing or two, about a thing or two. Mansplaining is deciding you're gonna search for the truth. Mansplain me, baby. Mansplain. There can be no thinking that would be uncool.
Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. I'm Mark, and I'm going to be your host for this week. And as always, I'm joined by Joe, an old friend from college. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Joe, this week's episode is something that is visible every day when I walk my dog, and yet it is something that, despite the large number of years of my life, I have not thought about often, which is the question that I think very few of us have thought to ask of why something very normal in our lives has become normal, when it became normal, and the reasons why we chose that thing rather than other things. And that is the grass that encircles houses. It seems like just a feature of the natural world that if you have a house, you should have a front and a back lawn. And yet it occurs to me every now and then that that's not a necessary choice. And yet it's a choice which pretty much everybody in our world makes. So I put the question to you. When and why did the grass lawn become a thing that everybody thought that they wanted and needed? And are there any signs that we are possibly at some point transitioning to a different thing to do with that space? So what did you find?
Yeah, well, the first thing I found is that there is actually a rich body of literature and criticism about this topic, which was surprising to me, too, because I had given it barely a thought in all my life, probably less than you. At least you saw some lawns and ruminated about it. I didn't even get that far.
Yeah, you're surrounded by concrete.
Yeah. But that said, the research for this episode was especially interesting for me. As you just said, I didn't grow up in the suburbs. I grew up in the city. I didn't mow lawns as a kid. I knew nothing about the life cycle of grass, what it means for a lawn to go to seed, which I'm going to discuss a little later. So I want to just thank you for exposing me to this subject because it was really interesting.
Yeah. Well, cool. I did have a personal relationship with grass because I grew up in Oregon. And in Oregon and in Washington, maybe in parts of Idaho too, there is this period, this very wet period in the winter and the early spring when it's just raining, and the grass grows very high, but you can't cut it then because it's wet and it's also muddy. And so there's this one time of the year when teenage boys like myself are sent out with a lawnmower to cut back 6 months worth of growth and then to collect all of that grass and put it in bags. And I just hated that job.
Yeah.
And so maybe all my life I've had this adversarial relationship with the idea of a grass lawn. And so now we're finally following up on that.
Yeah, so I want to start with a brief history of the grassy lawn, because that's where I started my research, and that's part of what made this so interesting for me. First, the word lawn. The word lawn is derived from the Middle French lande, L-A-N-D-E, as well as the Middle English word launde, L-A-U-N-D-E, which was later shortened to laund, L-A-U-N-D. And that last one, laund, is a word that was used by Shakespeare in at least one of his plays. It generally refers to an open, grassy clearing between or among trees, also known as a glade. It came to be used to describe the fields outside castles, which were often kept short so the inhabitants could see who was approaching. In England in the 1100s, low-growing areas of flowers and grasses were either grazed by sheep or cut by servants with scythes to keep them short, which led to the development of games like lawn bowling in the 12th and 13th centuries. Now, the modern lawn's origins come from 18th century Europe, where landscape designers in France and England favored closely cut, well-kept grassy areas none more famous than the gardens of the Palace of Versailles that included a feature that became common in French gardens, the tapis vert, or green carpet. These prototype ornamental lawns were early symbols of conspicuous consumption, for showing off that you didn't need all your land to grow crops.
Mm-hmm.
They required significant maintenance and were therefore grown only by rich landowners who had servants and or livestock to maintain them. Just in case you're wondering, the world's first lawn mower wasn't invented until 1830. Americans may have rebelled from British rule, but as one biodiversity educator put it, quote, "Our English inheritance is our own little tidy green space," end quote.
Yeah.
Thomas Jefferson was one of the first Americans to popularize the English-style lawn at his Monticello estate in 1806. While many other wealthy citizens followed Jefferson's lead, most Americans of the time devoted their yards either to vegetable or herb gardens or for animal grazing. In the mid to late 19th century, produce gardens moved to the rear of most properties and grassy front lawns became predominant. Just as they had democratized the politics they inherited from Great Britain, Americans democratized the British estate garden. In Michael Pollan's words, quote, "cutting the vast manorial greenswards into quarter-acre slices everyone could afford," end quote.
Mm-hmm. So if I can just sum up what I'm hearing here, the short-cropped grass lawn started out as a way of more effectively killing people who were attacking your castle.
Yeah.
And then transitioned into a display of conspicuous wealth because only the elite could afford both the land to display the lawn and also the peasants that you would need to keep it short.
Correct.
And then in typical fashion, the middle class started to ape the customs of the upper class as a way of just sort of demonstrating their own prosperity.
Yes, exactly. This democratization of the lawn happened for several reasons. One was the emergence of popular books about how children needed grassy spaces to play on. As lawns began appearing in magazine articles and gardening catalogs, the American lawn became less of a status symbol and more of a landscaping aesthetic. The first popular American landscaper, Andrew Jackson Downing, wrote a treatise on the theory and practice of landscape gardening in 1841, in which he maintained that it was essential to any garden's perfection to include an expanse of, quote, "grass mown into a softness like velvet," end quote. This trend was only heightened by the lush meadows designed for urban parks like Central Park in New York City, with their focus on large swaths of close-cropped lawn. Around the same time, improvements in lawnmower design and water retention techniques allowed lawn culture to migrate from its base in the Northeast to the southern U.S. In the emerging suburban communities to which the wealthy were beginning to flock, strict setback rules were put in place in which there had to be a 30-foot gap separating the home and the sidewalk or street. What better place to put a lawn? The national fad for lawns was reflected in Philadelphia's Centennial Exposition in 1876, America's first World's Fair, where lawn-growing displays were immensely popular. The first American golf course, built in New York State in 1888, with its country club setting and pasture-like playing surface, reinforced the lush grass standard that was already flourishing throughout the country. By 1901, the U.S. Congress enacted legislation to study which turf grasses were best for lawns, ushering in the lawn care industry. Today, there is no country on earth that prizes its lawns more than ours.
So when Congress was studying, what's the best kind of grass, do you know if they were looking into just ornamental grass or if it was what was best for that ecosystem? Like what were the criteria for best?
That's a good question. I did not research that answer, though I suspect it's ornamental grass because of the way the ornamental grass lawn took off in our country.
Yeah.
And the fact that there are so few species of turf grass today, which I'm going to mention shortly.
Right, right. And also just the timing of that. Like, as I was asking the question, I realized that kind of the answer presented itself, which is in 1901, there's no way Congress was going to be worrying about ecosystem health.
Yes.
That would have been way too ahead of the curve for something like that.
Yes, we're still in the growth phase. I'm going to get to the anti-growth portion shortly, but there's a couple other pieces of 20th century American legislation that I want to mention. One was passed in 1938 in the midst of the New Deal, and the other in 1944 during World War II. And they played a pivotal role in the rise of American lawn culture. The 40-hour work week and the GI Bill. Until weekends became legalized in 1938, Americans typically worked a half day on Saturdays, which made it hard for a Christian nation devoted to church and rest on Sundays to devote any serious time to their lawns.
Mm-hmm.
And then the post-World War II housing boom, facilitated by the GI Bill, led to millions of families purchasing suburban homes and becoming the stewards of their own front and backyards.
Right, right.
Abraham Levitt, the builder of America's first industrial suburb, Levittown in New York, wrote that, quote, "No single feature of a suburban residential community contributes as much to the charm and beauty of the individual home and the locality as well-kept lawns." End quote.
Yeah. It's just now occurring to me as you say that the story of the lawn is also the story of the suburb, right? The growth of lawns and the growth of suburbs go hand in hand.
Yes, absolutely.
Where the big city, the urban environment, like where you grew up, that's the engine of wealth. But then once you acquire the wealth, you go to the suburbs, and one of the first things you do is you look for the house with the white picket fence, and the white picket fence is encircling a lawn.
Yes, that's quite true. The only thing I would say is that for the people who are lucky enough to have property in the city that was bigger than a postage stamp, they too put lawns down. So you will find lawns in the one-family home section of any big city.
Yeah.
As Michael Pollan put it, quote, "France has its formal geometric gardens, England its picturesque parks, and America this unbounded democratic river of manicured lawn along which we array our houses." End quote. Artist and philosopher Kevin Melchione wrote of post-war suburban development with its accent on endless front lawns, quote, "The homeowner is a caretaker of a parcel of a collective aesthetic project." End quote. Now, the Wikipedia article on lawns points out that they, quote, "became a means of performing class values for the urban middle class, in which the condition of the lawn becomes representative of moral character and social reliability," end quote. Those values were strictly enforced by rigid social pressure in which one's neighbors or homeowners association decreed that poorly kept lawns adversely affected property values, and then buttressed by state or local laws prohibiting unkempt lawns with out-of-control weeds, punishable by fines or civil litigation. And of course, the lawn care industry made its mark by propagating the myth of a perfect lawn, attainable only with the use of expensive lawn mowers and other gadgetry, as well as chemical fertilizers, herbicides, and pesticides. Today, lawn culture is even taught in schools, with several major American universities offering degrees in turf management. The homogeneous monoculture of American lawns became well entrenched by the middle of the 20th century and was still growing into the 21st century. The U.S. currently has about 45 million acres of grass lawns. That's an area 8 times the size of New Jersey, with another nearly 600 square miles of new turf grass being planted each year. Satellite observations from NASA confirm that about 23% of the total surface area in urban and suburban areas of the United States is devoted to lawns. Lawn grass is America's most irrigated crop, taking up more land than wheat or corn, which I found surprising for a nation often referred to as the breadbasket of the world. The green lawn is now an iconic American phenomenon. Some of America's best culture writers have commented on its hold over our imaginations. Megan Garber, writing in The Atlantic, underscored the cultural significance of lawns. Quote, "For much of American history, the healthy lawn, green, lush, neatly shorn, has been a symbol not just of prosperity, individual and communal, but of something deeper, shared ideals, collective responsibility, the assorted conveniences of conformity," end quote. Now I want to put a special accent on that last word, conformity, because I'm going to get back to that. Writing in the New York Times Magazine, Michael Pollan described the American lawn as a vehicle of consensus, and mowing it a civic responsibility. The New Yorker's Elizabeth Colbert wrote, quote, "A lawn came to signal its owner's commitment to a communitarian project, the upkeep of the greensward that linked one yard to the next," end quote. What would it take for Americans to reconsider their lawns? You mentioned grass alternatives in your question when you put it to me last time. The anti-lawn movement started several decades ago, with some tracing its genesis to 1962 and the furor caused by the publication of Silent Spring, Rachel Carson's groundbreaking book exposing the hazards of indiscriminate use of DDT, and in so doing, implicating American suburbia's front and back yards where the dirty deed was done. Since then, scientists have determined that all those perfectly manicured suburban lawns are basically biological deserts, the overuse of pesticides making them emblems of declining biodiversity. A naturalist for the National Wildlife Federation quipped, quote, "You might as well have AstroTurf when it comes to the value of lawns to birds and butterflies," end quote. This has significant ecological implications for everything from the soil profile to water consumption, the diversity of microfauna, air quality, energy use, and limited opportunities for nesting birds and other wildlife. Long-term research conducted by the National Science Foundation examined residential lawns outside major cities all over the country, representing different climates and types of vegetation. It found that the genetic similarities in turf grasses, those low-growing varieties that form thick carpet-like surfaces on your lawn, were, quote, "contributing to a continental-scale ecological homogenization," end quote. The author and sustainable yard advocate Pam Pennick likened the ubiquity of a few species of grasses and shrubs to, quote, "driving cross-country on the interstate and seeing the same 4 fast food restaurants at every exit," end quote. And it's not just the turf grass, even the weeds are the same. That National Science Foundation project also incorporated demographic information about the households whose lawns were being studied. Researchers found that the lawns of residents with higher incomes had significantly lower levels of plant diversity than those of lower income residents. The study's authors attribute that to the wealthier residents' ability to spend more on lawn care services to remove unwanted plants, which of course lowers the biodiversity. Other studies found that people who treated their lawns with pesticides were more educated and therefore more likely than non-pesticide users to understand the environmental risks of their actions. Even so, they use fertilizer and pesticides to preserve neighborhood cohesion, since nobody wants to be the neighbor with the overgrown grass or weeds in his yard. That's the conformity piece.
Right, right. And families that are more wealthy, more established, of higher standing have more to lose within their communities if
Yes.
if they would appear to be out of step with community standards, and so perhaps more deferential to those rules.
That's right. And that makes perfect sense. And yet it was counterintuitive to me, because usually when you hear stories about the disparate impacts of things on rich and poor people, the poor people always get shafted, right? The rich people escape unscathed. But in this case, it's the opposite. The rich people are tending lawns that are biological deserts, because they have the money to poison their lawns, basically.
Right.
While poorer people have more biologically diverse lawns.
Right.
I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, it is. And also interesting is that I'm seeing exceptions to that rule in Seattle currently, and maybe this will play into some material you'll introduce later. But you walk around and you see every house here is expensive, so it's not like there's any, poor people in this neighborhood. It's more just like wealth and more wealth. But within the particularly nice houses, you see more adventurous gardens, greater diversity in terms of plant species, greater diversity in terms of landscaping concepts being applied. And it's still not natural in any respect. It's still very much cultivated, but it's as if some families are consciously, unconsciously using the diversity of the gardens to signal greater mastery, greater insight, greater aesthetic to those things.
Yes.
And so you do see like these marvelously abundant and very diverse array of flowers and bushes there as kind of the counterpoint to what you're talking about there. And these are in front of houses that are probably worth $4 or $5 million.
Yeah. So what you're seeing is real, but it is a newish phenomenon. And I am going to talk about it very shortly. So we'll get there. So this turn against lawns, generally speaking, is about more than biodiversity. One residual economic effect of the Great Recession that began in 2008 was for many Americans to dig up their decorative lawns and replant them with fruit and vegetable gardens. Lawns that were once a source of civic pride and suburban class consciousness are now increasingly seen as economically and environmentally untenable. So this might be one of the phenomena that you noticed. On average, lawns require greater amounts of fertilizer, herbicide, and pesticide than an equivalent area of cultivated farmland. That surprised me. They create more disturbances to the ecosystem, environmental pollution, and greater health risks to humans and wildlife. Fertilizer runoff finds its way to our waterways, creating toxic algae blooms and aquatic dead zones that starve fish and other marine life of oxygen. As I mentioned, the cookie-cutter homogeneity of lawns destroys biodiversity by greatly reducing or replacing the plant species that feed and house pollinators. To keep them free of invasive pests, lawns require the overuse of fertilizers and pesticides. And the latter of which, pesticides, that's poison by another name. Some pesticides include carcinogens and endocrine disruptors that remain permanently in the ecosystem and adversely affect the health of its organisms, including but not limited to the killing of 7 million birds per year. According to the Natural Resources Defense Council, each year in our country, lawns consume 60 to 70 million pounds of pesticides, more than 10 times the amount used for farming. Again, that surprised me. And 200 million gallons of gas for all that mowing. And while we're on the subject of gas, here's a fun fact for you, Mark. 17 million of those 200 million gallons is gasoline accidentally spilled while refueling lawn care equipment. And just to put that in perspective, 17 million gallons, that's about 50% more oil than was spilled during the Exxon Valdez disaster in 1989. So that's happening every year.
Yeah.
And of course, all that lawn mowing, leaf blowing, and weed whacking exacerbates climate change by turning our supposedly pristine, naturalistic lawns into net emitters of carbon. Then there's the watering of our lawns, which strains water supplies in arid places like the Southwest U.S. Here are some more numbers to consider. Americans use about 7 billion gallons of fresh water per day on their lawns. And the National Weather Service estimates that half of it is wasted to runoff and evaporation from overwatering. We've all seen those sprinklers that are on forever and there's like 6-inch puddles where they're sprinkling.
Right.
The typical 25 by 40 foot yard requires 10,000 gallons of water in just one summer. According to the EPA, about a third of residential water in the U.S. is used for landscaping, which translates to approximately 200 gallons of fresh water per person per day reserved for watering the nation's lawns. As a city slicker, these numbers astound me, and I just wonder whether they're astounding you too.
They do. It's such a good example of the sort of thing where there's such a negative cost, but you don't notice it because it's become so normalized.
Yes.
Like it's just become so deeply ingrained in the way that we live that you don't put together the numbers. If everybody is doing something, then the cumulative cost of that thing will be overwhelming. But because everybody's doing the thing, it seems completely normal and out of bounds for something that you would challenge.
Yes. And because it wasn't until just a few decades ago, almost within our lifetimes, that environmental stewardship became a thing, you know? Mm-hmm. So just the people didn't give a second thought to setting their sprinkler on high for all day and, you know, pouring poison into the ground. They didn't even recognize it as poison till quite recently.
Right.
With minds like steel tracks, walking joy here to discern the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. And spring, it's a calling and they do it for you. And spring me, baby, and spring, it's a calling that you don't do it too.
The cultural anthropologist Alex Korsunsky identified some of the stakes involved in America's over-cultivation of lawns. Lawns take up space that could otherwise be used more productively for home gardening and urban agriculture. Korsunsky writes that in many places in the USA, unused open spaces are, quote, not generally a result of a positive decision to leave room for some use, but rather an expression of a pastoral aesthetic norm that prizes spacious lawns and the zoning restrictions and neighborhood covenants that give these norms the force of law, end quote.
Yeah, to which I would add the force of leisure, which is the lawn around a house. It's something that, yes, you intermittently need to mow, but for the most part, it's something which you sit on in a chair with a glass of iced tea. Whereas gardening or urban agriculture, those are two labor-intensive activities. And so not many people, a few people are enthusiastic about that, but not many people would be enthusiastic about putting in, 8-9 hours at your job and then coming home and getting down on your hands and knees and weeding in the backyard.
Yes, and indeed in a lot of the essays I read, and I read a shitload of them, there'd be a lot of sources posted for this episode, they made that very point, that the labor intensivity of gardening precludes a lot of people from becoming the kind of environmental stewards that they might want to, and it's just easier to plant turf grass.
Yeah, 100%.
I want to get back to something else that Alex Korsunsky said. So he's a cultural anthropologist. I like his perspective here. He also said that the ubiquity and what he called the toxic sterility of wildly underutilized lawns leads to, quote, the expenditure of billions of dollars and countless hours of labor in the ongoing struggle to permanently arrest an ecosystem in an immature monoculture that provides few ecological services, end quote. Our lawns may be emerald green in hue, but that doesn't make them natural. For one thing, almost none of the turf grasses used for American lawns are native to America. Did you know that, Mark? I didn't.
No.
Even the famous Kentucky bluegrass originated in Asia.
How many people in Kentucky are aware of that?
No, I mean, this is one of many revelations to me doing the research. That's why this was so interesting. Another quirk of the perpetually green lawn is that grass's natural survival mechanism is to go dormant during certain times of the year when it's either too hot or too cold. Grass protects itself by turning yellowish or brown during these times. That's not a sign of disease or death, but rather a resting phase in which its growth is slowed so it can conserve energy until better conditions return. Again, I'm an ignoramus on this. I didn't know that.
Yeah. I think most people looking at a yellow lawn would think, oh, it's dead. Like they didn't take good enough care of that.
Death or disease.
Yeah.
That's right. Yes, and that's not the case. And to Alex Korsunski's point about an immature monoculture, because I really like that phrase, grass naturally goes to seed if it's allowed to grow out, which almost never happens on American lawns. Weekly mowing basically keeps lawn grasses in a state of perpetual adolescence, which is a little creepy if you think about it. Michael Pollan picked up on things being out of whack in a brilliant essay about mowing his lawn. And this is going to be the first source I cite on our Facebook page, because it's really a thing of beauty, this essay, and I urge everybody to read it. This is an extended quote from it. Lawns, I am convinced, are a symptom of and a metaphor for our skewed relationship to the land. They teach us that, with the help of petrochemicals and technology, we can bend nature to our will. Under the mower's brutal, indiscriminate rotor, the landscape is subdued, homogenized, dominated utterly. Mowing the lawn, I felt like I was battling the earth rather than working it. Each week it sent forth a green army, and each week I beat it back with my infernal machine. End quote.
Mm-hmm. Definitely resonates with my teenage experience battling that lawn, and in most days the lawn was winning.
Yes. Okay, so now I want to pivot to lawn alternatives because I've set up the anti-lawn movement. Now let's talk about what they're advocating. The Audubon Society sponsors sustainable landscaping programs in places like Portland, Oregon, that promote the planting of native species and the elimination of pesticides. Nationally, the Homegrown National Park Project encourages homeowners to increase their yard's biodiversity by planting native species, which is particularly important because non-native varieties are often shunned by local insects and the birds who eat them. There are also researchers thinking about what American lawns might look like in a world where climate change-induced heat waves have turned many lawns yellow or brown. One approach involved xeriscaping. I'd never heard this word before. It's spelled Xeriscaping. It's a water conservation method that uses native drought-resistant plants and more efficient irrigation techniques. So you're planting plants that use the least water. Research suggests that xeriscaped yards attract more insects and birds. It's becoming more and more popular in drier regions of the country, with recent droughts prompting desert states like Utah, Arizona, Nevada, and California to incentivize residents with rebates to replace turf grass. But xeriscaping can be done anywhere to cut back on water use. Scientists are also investigating other techniques like capturing more rainwater runoff and improving wildlife habitat. So there's this growing number of younger homeowners, landscapers, and gardeners that now see the grass lawn as an anachronism at best and a mortal threat to the environment at worst. I suspect some of the people in that group are these neighbors whose lawns you've seen recently in your neighborhood, the non-grass dominated lawns. For these people, it's out with the old monocultural lawn, in with the new multicultural alternatives. It's happening incrementally, to be sure, but as you referenced in your comment about seeing some of your neighbors' non-grassy gardens, it's definitely happening. What used to be lawns might now be a patchwork of wildflower beds, vegetables, fruit trees, with moss, native plants, and perennials replacing the formerly ubiquitous turf grass. Some property owners are simply mowing less and allowing old foes like clover and dandelions to be part of their relaxed, wilder-looking lawns. There's more use of gravel or succulent plants in water-starved places. The focus is shifting from pristine carpets to surfaces that are friendly to pollinators. With "brown is the new green" slowly gaining traction as a slogan for our times, even just letting your grass go dormant at the height of summer is an improvement over the status quo. And let's not forget the power of public pressure. Drought shaming became a thing in California about a decade ago, as some folks, including celebrities like Tom Selleck, ignored water use restrictions to keep their lawns green. One of the few silver linings of the COVID pandemic is that it led to an explosion of interest in gardening, with many people suddenly at home with much more time to consider growing their own food to pair with the sourdough bread they were baking. So, as we said, gardening is extremely labor-intensive, but when you've got a lot more time, there's openings for that. The new idea is that a truly useful lawn isn't just ornamental. It has to be multi-use, a garden of abundance, serving other purposes like food production, like species habitat. It's almost an aesthetic change in that traditional lawns didn't look so beautiful anymore to the Americans who were watching them wilt before their eyes in real time. A landscape designer named Bethany Ridmark summed up the old and new ethos well in remarks she made to Outside Magazine. Quote, "There's been a connection for so long between the state of your yard and wealth and image. But maybe the true value is in knowing that the land you're caring for now has a variety of species, and that's supporting other animals and insects, and you're cultivating this ecologically healthy piece of land." End quote. So I don't want to overstate the reach of the anti-lawn movement, which is still dwarfed by the lawn industrial complex. Despite the anti-lawn arguments gaining traction, and they are gaining traction, lawns remain the default option in most places in America, and they're not going away anytime soon. Again, there are a lot of reasons for this, and I'll just run off a few here. To this day, many of America's mythic spaces are lawns. Think about this. The South Lawn of the White House, the Great Lawn in Central Park, the outfield grass at your favorite baseball stadium. Just as Jay Gatsby sent his gardener to mow his neighbor Nick Carraway's lawn in F. Scott Fitzgerald's classic novel published 100 years ago this year, old habits die hard. Many homeowners associations and municipalities still have ordinances regulating the height of the grass, and in recent years, people have been fined, arrested, and even jailed for not maintaining their lawns to community standards. The multi-billion-dollar lawn care industry has an army of paid lobbyists hell-bent on maintaining the status quo of grassy expanses. Even if you're so inclined, successfully replacing a grass lawn with other plantings can take a generation or longer. A lot of people are afraid of bees and don't want to reintroduce pollinators to their property. And then there's just inertia. And I know how that feels. I just finally cut the cord and got rid of my cable TV service a few weeks ago after thinking about it literally for decades. Similarly, lots of people will wait until a critical mass of their neighbors get rid of their lawns before acting. In short, the green lawn's days are numbered, but it's a large number.
Yeah, that sounds true to me. And as you were talking about that, I was thinking that in this country, we like to think about social change being driven from the bottom up. But the lawn itself was introduced from the top down. It started with the king and his castle and filtered down through that. And I wonder if this is something that's not going to change until the elite that we recognize today decides that lawns are lame and then starts articulating that perspective within their Instagram feeds or whatever it is. And it starts filtering down. Like if the influencers, the pop stars, the politicians, whoever it is that people look to for inspiration and guidance, if those guys are saying that having a lawn is stupid and wasteful and bourgeois and boring, then that's what's going to cut the heart out of that lawn lobby, which is always going to have an incentive to keep things the way they are.
Yeah.
And so I'm turning to the Paris Hiltons of the world to start changing people's minds.
Save us, Paris.
Yes, save us, Paris. Yeah. Post to your streams about how lawns suck and are they're the sort of thing that your grandmother liked, but that the new cool people, they don't like lawns anymore. That's probably what's going to change people's minds.
Yeah, I agree in terms of like the critical mass, that there probably isn't a critical mass yet, and there needs to be a critical mass, and having influencers at the head of that table is useful. I'd only quibble maybe with don't want to overstate that point either, because it takes some intrepid pioneers to get the ball moving, and the intrepid pioneers have already shown themselves. My mother was talking about Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, back in the 1970s, when we would go on vacation to Cape Cod or something. We'd be in a little forest thicket and she didn't hear any birds. She would wonder aloud whether the birds weren't there because of pesticide use, So people like Rachel Carson kind of seeded the ground already. And the anti-lawn movement is growing incrementally, as you see in your own neighborhood, with people using cactus and gravel instead of grass, Mm-hmm. But to your point, it hasn't reached that true pivot point yet, that what I call the critical mass juncture. And it will. I'm confident it will. That's what I'm here to say. But I don't want to take a guess. This is not like, is AGI 2 years away or 5 years away? I think this is probably longer term, but the ground is turning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, if I think of it, I'll go around and I'll take some pictures of these lawns I'm talking about, because some of them are truly these non-lawns that I've been talking about, because some of them are truly astonishing. And I think one of the biggest obstacles here is just how labor intensive it is to have something other than grass in front of your house. Like, just so much work. And
yes.
In a funny way, the original lawns were a signal of conspicuous consumption, because you could hire peasants to go out with scythes and keep the grass short.
Right.
Or have the tenants on your lands come in with their flocks and have the goats nibble it short. And today's most conspicuous consumption is being able to afford a team of landscape artists to come out and take care of these elaborate lawns that you have. But the difference is that the previous form of conspicuous consumption could trickle down because the lawnmower was invented. But I'm not sure what future invention, maybe it's robots, I don't know, is going to trickle down where the more elaborate non-lawn lawn is going to trickle down, because it just takes so much work to do. Yeah. It takes such a personal investment to be out there cultivating your tomatoes and your strawberries and your various bushes. We were visiting this family the other day in Seattle, and they do have a beautiful setup where they've got not just bushes and flowers, but also strawberries and cherry tomatoes and apple trees and just so much. But one of the things she was doing was taking these little sleeves and putting it over each baby apple on the tree so that insects and birds wouldn't take it.
Yeah.
And it's like, for heaven's sake, so much work. It's wonderful when the apples are there, but it's so much work getting to the point where the apples are there.
Yeah.
And I think that's the line in the sand that most people are just never going to cross, because they don't have the time, or they would like to dedicate that time to something other than just investing it back into what's encircling their house.
Let me say two quick things about that. The first is that for people who are growing vegetables or spices or something, that's a labor of love. That's a self-selecting community. And I think those people are willing to put the time in, because it's such a joy to have tomato you grow in your backyard be in the salad you're eating, right? So I think that they don't mind the labor that's required. Now, scaling that up to every American, point well taken. But for the group that's doing it now, I don't think it's an onerous chore for them. Right. But then the other thing I want to say is, in my reading for this episode, I didn't mention it because it wasn't relevant to your question, but there are people planting like native grasses and wildflowers that don't, and replacing their turf grass with that. And it doesn't need to be mowed, or it needs to be mowed once a season instead of once a week, you know? And because you're not growing tomatoes, they don't need to be picked. You're just growing wildflowers and enjoying the beauty of the flowers and having all the bees and butterflies come to your property. So there are a lot of low labor ways to replant that I didn't really spend a lot of time on, but is not only sensible from a time perspective, but also sensible from an environmental perspective, because you're replacing fake foreign turf grasses with what should have been growing there in the first place. And we have examples of this in the public domain too. There's a park in New York called the High Line. I don't know if you've heard about it. It was a railroad track about 30 feet above street grade.
Joe, you're forgetting, you and I walked down the High Line together the last time I visited New York.
Oh, God, senior moment. Yes. Okay, so you know what I mean about the High Line. All the native grasses growing 2, 3, 4 feet high. It's just a beautiful sight of undisturbed nature. And that's, people can return their lawns to that eventually. And that requires very little upkeep, relatively speaking.
Yeah, no, you're right. That's the answer to my question, is that in a way, I was making perfect the enemy of the good.
Yeah.
Where I was imagining, trying to get people to transition to elaborate alternatives to grass, when really what we just need is them to transition to an equally or even more easy alternative to grass that doesn't have the same environmental cost that current practices do.
Right. And let's not underestimate the power of climate change to change our perspectives about this. There are a lot of people still maintaining lawns and feeling like they're fighting a losing battle against heat and humidity and wildfires and natural disasters, and that they may just pack it in for that reason. It's an unwinnable battle against climate change.
Right. My final thought gets back to one thing you mentioned pretty early on, which is that some of the pro-lawn theorists fairly early in this history were writing about how a lawn is a great place to play for children.
Yeah.
And so it's something that parents should aspire to give their kids a space to play. I can speak from my own personal experience. We had a lawn in our front yard. We didn't really want to play there because, that was right at home. It was ordinary. It wasn't exciting. It wasn't that fun. We would leave our lawns and go play somewhere else, whether that was an overgrown field or in some cases, we'd go up into the woods that surrounded where we were living and actually play in the forest. So kids, you might think that you're growing a lawn so that they'd have a space to play, but where they want to play is somewhere other than your lawn.
Yes. And to that very point, I'm going to tell a story now that I didn't think I was going to tell. It wasn't in my mind at all to tell during this episode, but I think is perfectly appropriate to what you just said. My wife and I have friends who raised their children in the city and then moved to the suburbs when the kids were 5 or 6 years old. And when they got to the suburbs, they would walk around the neighborhood with their kids, and the kids would see like playground equipment in everybody's backyard and say to their parents, "Let's go to that playground, that one there." And the parents would have to say, "Oh, I'm sorry, honey, that's not a playground. That's somebody's private property." And then they'd walk to the next driveway and see the next playground set up. "Let's go to that one." And it's just completely different ethic, right? That people are tending to their own property, and maybe that's not necessary.
Yeah. But thank you. This was a fun and interesting ramble through the fields and the lawns of history.
Yes.
It's fascinating to me that this all started with a military technique. Cut down the trees and the bushes surrounding your castle so that if someone's trying to creep up on you, you'll see them before they get to your walls.
Yes. Yes. And I do hope if you do take pictures of those places in your neighborhood that you post them to our Facebook page right after my sources. That might be an interesting thing for people to see.
Yeah, I'll make a point of doing that. So do you have a question for me for next time?
Yeah. And I just want to preface this by saying I was inspired by your what I would call an unusual question relative to our recent mansplaining topics, all these big matters we're talking about one after the other. And this was kind of an unusual question. I want to return the favor and ask you something unusual. And this question might be the first question I ever jotted down in my notebook to ask you, Mark. It's been on my list of potential topics since we started this podcast, but I hadn't summoned the courage to ask it before because I worry that you and our listeners might perceive it as silly. But because I really do think about it frequently, I'm going to ask you about it now. Okay, let me tee it up this way. What do the following common household items have in common? A jar of aspirin, a tube of toothpaste, a clear plastic bottle, a package of KN95 masks. You want to hazard a guess, or should I just get right to the answer?
I have no idea, so give me the answer.
Yeah. Answer. They all have expiration dates stamped on them or their packaging. And it's not just these 4 products. Look at the fine print around your apartment, Mark. Chances are you'll find them on dozens of other products, as I have. Now, I get the concept of expiration dates for perishable food, but I find it hard to believe that my toothpaste or my aspirin can be good one day and bad the next.
Yeah.
So here's my 2 questions for you, Mark. First, do these products truly expire? Or is this, as I suspect, a lie, a ruse perpetrated by their manufacturers to get you to buy them again and again and again? And then second, if my hunch is wrong, and all those expiration dates are genuine, is the expiration of our household stuff a function of planned obsolescence? And by that I mean purposely making things that must be replaced sooner rather than later.
Okay. I can tell you this will be a controversial topic within my own household because my wife believes deeply in expiration dates, and I tend to think of them as sort of guidelines, but not absolute rules.
Yes.
So particularly where food is concerned, I hate to throw out food. So I figure that even if something has expired in the refrigerator, I'm going to give it the sniff test before that goes into the garbage.
Yes. But at least with food, there's an inherent logic to that, right?
Right.
It's going to go bad. It's going to look bad and smell bad, right? But that's not true of toothpaste. So I'm suspicious.
Yes, I will. I'll make a point of asking the sources specifically about the expiration of toothpaste so we can get to the bottom of that.
Yeah. But then don't forget, you might quickly dispel, I could be totally off base here. You might quickly dispel the idea of conspiracy and these expiration dates all being false, as I suspect, right? But if that's the case, I want to have a more philosophical conversation about planned obsolescence. They used to say that Chevy made its car to fall apart in 4 years, so you buy another Chevy and for the 5th year, right? Okay. Is that what's going on here with all these household items? Yeah. I wonder.
Yeah, it's definitely something to wonder because those companies have an incentive to drive more sales. But then there's also the incentive not to make you think that their product is lower in value because it expires too quickly. So, yeah, it's an interesting question to ponder, and I look forward to getting into that.
Yes.
That will take me 2, maybe 3 weeks. We'll see how that goes. In the meantime, our audience sitting out on their lawns with a glass of iced tea in their hands can be pondering the same question and see if the answers that they get to match up with the one that I find in the research. So we will see you then, because this episode is now at a close. I'm Mark, and that was Joe, and we'll see you in a few weeks.
Talk to you next time.
Just so some feet candy ass can trespass. Get off my lawn, you're just a pawn, and I'm the king of my castle. Retreat from my turf, Smurf, or you'll find yourself 6 feet under the earth.
Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Music composed and performed by the Mansplaining House Band. Thank you for spending your time with us, and we'll see you next time.
Best thing is deciding you're gonna search for the truth. Mansplain me, baby. Mansplain it. There can be no faking, that would be uncool.
Attention mansplaining listeners. If you want to engage with Mark and me, you have some options. One is to go to our Facebook page, Mansplaining the Podcast, where you can leave a comment or question, check our sources, suggest topics for future episodes, or just like us. Because who doesn't want to be liked? You can also reach us through whatever app you use to listen to this podcast by giving us a 5-star rating or writing a review of your favorite episode. Or you can call and leave us a message on our dedicated voicemail box, which is 206-486-4074. And did you know that you can now listen to full episodes of Mansplaining on YouTube and check out our podcast music on Spotify? Yep, it's true. Just type Mansplaining Podcast into the search bar on either platform and you'll find us. It's lonely in podcast land, and we welcome and appreciate any feedback you might want to share. Act now and we'll throw in a set of Ginsu knives. Not really.